is January 1871. The Prussians have just defeated the French army, made up of poor, rural conscripts from the countryside, who had recently died fighting for a revolutionary government based in Paris. A year before, the Second French Empire was forced by legislative decree to declare war against the German Confederation, led by the Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, under the misguided notion that the free independent German states along the eastern marches of France would become nationalistic and gradually bring their political allegiances into the Prussian sphere. For the French Parliament had once again become a hotbed of leftist and social democratic agents, as it had been during the 1848 revolution some 23 years earlier, and, for all intents and purposes, it was the first modern standing European parliament occupied almost exclusively by liberal socialists. During the siege of Paris, in late September of 1870, these political agenteurs, when the battle was thickest on the outskirts of the great capital, went into the working-class neighborhoods to agitate the starving populace, having elicited the aid of key members within the National Guard, thus betraying their responsibilities to the nation of France in her direst need. In the ensuing riots, thousands of Parisians died, brothers murdering one another, priests and small shopkeepers killed outright while defending their churches or businesses, while anarchist and communist red flags were carried in waves through the streets. By October, the government of national defense ostensibly ruled in Paris. However, many arrondissements, or districts, were still operating under armed revolutionary forces, and they, with complete disregard for the French people, continued to undermine the defenses of the country. Their continuous sabotage only prolonged the siege, forcing many conservative parties, now no longer owning any political authority, to go abroad in Europe to seek an armistice with those powers willing to intercede on the nation's behalf. By January, with the rest of France now subdued, Bismarck had had enough, and on the morning of the 5th, at sunrise, brought the entire German artillery at his disposal to bear, bombarding Paris day and night for the next 2 weeks. The suffering of the inhabitants was made more complicated by the social erosion caused by almost a year of political infighting. While the rural areas of France had, by this time, accepted the situation, organizing into small, regional governments made up of local nationalists and conservatives, which sued for peace on the 26th of January. Perhaps undeserving of the favor, special conditions were arranged at Versailles by these provincial representatives for the city of Paris herself, in that she would not be occupied by the German armies. The concessions for this unprecedented leniency were that a brief victory parade through the center of Paris be held by a small number of Saxon, Bavarian, and Prussian forces, which was conducted on March 1, 1871, and that the city itself pay an indemnity of 200 million francs, which was a substantial sum, to Prussia. Bismarck honored the agreement in full, which included the preservation of the National Guard, so that France would not be left undefended, and a day after signing the armistice, he ordered trainloads of food to be brought into the beleaguered city. A few days after the Prussian forces had left, the National Guard, whose leadership was now composed of social revolutionaries, dispersed its soldiers throughout the streets of Paris, taking some 200 cannon into strategic sections of the city. A fraudulent election was then held on the 26th of March, with only 40% of the populace taking part, while no conservatives or nationalists dared vote due to concerns of violence at the polls. The following day, a parliament of communists, liberal socialists, and anarchists celebrated their election victory outside the Hôtel de Ville, and from the rooftops they waved the new unofficial flag of France, a soulless, blood-red banner. The first 2 laws enacted by the Paris Commune were that no military force other than the National Guard could be formed, and by law all healthy male citizens had to be members of it, essentially making them part of a central Red Army, conscriptable at a moment's notice, with any refusal to serve under penalty of execution by firing squad. The second law gave employees the right to cooperatively assume control of and direct any business in which they worked, if the owner could not functionally operate it. During the period of economic turmoil that ensued, hundreds of successful businesses went bankrupt and therefore became communized in short order, thus spelling disaster for Parisian industry and the French economy more broadly, while ensuring that starvation and murder would become the daily norm in the doomed city. The conceptual terms of patriarchy and feminist were also first conceived of at this time. Although women were not active in government, feminist colleges were established throughout Paris so that young women could learn how to pursue a life of activism through the global struggle against capitalism. These associations demanded gender and wage equality, the right of divorce for women, the right of a secular non-Christian education, and access to professional trades. They also demanded suppression of the distinction between married women and concubines, and between legitimate and illegitimate children, and the Women's Union participated in several municipal commissions and organized cooperative workshops to push for these and other issues. France was now split in two. The conservative government at Versailles ruled the provinces and rural areas still loyal to the church and traditional French customs, while the radical commune ruled in Paris, constituting a population that was atheistic and anti-conservative. But soon cracks began to emerge on the edifice of the Parisian government, and as spring issued into April, those who lived in the French countryside could only look on in horror as the commune moved ever towards increasingly fanatical policies, which ended in one of that nation's greatest bloodbaths. Deep divisions between the anarchists, social liberals, and communists were already making the Paris Commune ungovernable, but this did not stop it from creating the Committee of Public Safety, a secret police force given extrajudicial powers of execution and charged with hunting down enemies of the revolution. The first series of extreme measures began with the seizure and destruction of conservative newspapers. Owners' and publishers' lives were spared if the printing presses were voluntarily handed over to pro-communard agents who would then operate them as communist propaganda outlets. Next came a decree accusing the Catholic Church of complicity in the crimes of the previous monarchy, proclaiming that there was no God, and that biblical subject matter produced or promoted in any public place was punishable by death. Dozens of churches were burned down or closed, and some 100 priests were arrested, including the Archbishop of Paris, who was later executed. Some 200 nuns were also arrested, many of whom were gang raped by anarchists, with dozens committing suicide after having been so violated. National and conservative monuments came next. Many of these were torn down, the most magnificent of which, the Vendôme column, honoring the victories of Napoleon, was pulled to the ground while a communard band played La Marseillaise. Untold numbers of ancient statuary, paintings, books, and religious artifacts were systematically destroyed, and with these, much of France's cultural history. While these outrages were consuming the attention of the Paris Commune and its leadership, the official government of France began gathering its forces in preparation for an all-out assault on Paris, with the intention of a merciless rout. Bismarck, as per the Franco-Prussian peace accord, released thousands of captured French soldiers, many of whom re-enlisted under the Versailles banner, with a desire to bring vengeance down upon the Parisian National Guard, who had sold them out on the field of battle for the principles of communism, anarchism, and atheism. Once assembled, an able, grizzled general who had fought for Napoleon III, Patrice de MacMahon, was given command of the French army, and he wasted little time. The most strategic point in Paris's defenses was Fort Issy, commanded by a former mechanic by the name of Léon Mégy, who had been given 20 years hard labor for clubbing a policeman to death. The communists repealed his sentence, citing that the officer represented the old patriarchy, and that Mégy's murder was a class-based political act of heroism. He was promoted to colonel, and stationed to protect the fortress which directly blocked the route of the French army into Paris. But due to his incompetence in military matters, he allowed the Versailles army to install cannon within range unharassed. After 3 days of heavy bombardment, MacMahon offered to spare the defenders' lives if they simply walked away. Mégy consented, and Paris was now completely open. Meanwhile, the leadership within the Paris Commune began to quarrel as things unraveled, ending in the absurd appointment of a Marxist journalist to the command of the National Guard. And so it was that on Sunday, May 21, 1871, 60,000 French troops entered an unprotected section of Point de Jour, and there began a week of unrelenting bloodshed, for each cobblestone was contested for, and the indoctrinated Parisians, fearing the wrath of the Commune more than the murder of their own brethren, decided that death under such circumstances was acceptable, and nearly 20,000 of them died on the altar of revolutionary communism. The French Third Republic was established a few months later, but there was an ominous aftermath to this appalling episode in European history. An entire generation of socialists, communists, anarchists, feminists, and various liberal allies had learned how to network with one another, from the highest political places all the way down to the undergrounds of European society. They now knew how to technically manifest this recurring theme of revolutionary social activism, how to endorse and fund it, and what its targets had to be. And for the past 150 years, the subtle development of this power base has slowly and systematically eroded European culture, to a point where today it is now completely defenseless, open to the worst sort of nihilistic, neoliberal tyranny imaginable. On one final note, Bismarck, and the Prussian aristocratic class in whom he was invested, foresaw the political climate in France as a danger to European national sovereignty, and Germanic self-realization in particular, and this has been documented in numerous observations attributed to him. The spillover effect of the revolutionary socialist fervor infecting the urban areas of France had a far-reaching influence within the more populated centers of the German Confederation, and a war had become necessary in stemming this culture-breaking tide. We will never know all the reasons for his going to war, but there can be no doubt that it slowed the progress of European revolutionary activity considerably. Unfortunately, it taught liberal, social activists many valuable lessons, while developing an underground movement that could not be monitored nor contained, as it continued to wage an asymmetrical war against Western culture and peoples. In the 20th century, communism would go on to murder over 80 million Europeans, while its proxy, Western liberal nations would go on to nullify the existence of tens of millions of babies of European heritage through aggressive, legally sanctioned abortion policies. One can now only wonder whether Bismarck would have been so lenient on Paris and her decadent liberal populace had he known how the course of history would unfold, and like another German leader some 70 years after him, who was also perhaps too charitable on this center of cultural decay. With this foresight, would he have razed it to the ground, blotting out its memory forever, thus preventing its corrosive social influence from spreading into the very heart of European man?